Morning, everyone. Wow, 8 a.m. Way to go. Jeffrey, thanks for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
I want to begin with the understanding that diabetes is this sort of global condition. It affects millions of people. Probably everyone in this room, or nearly everyone in this room, at least knows somebody that has diabetes. But if you don't, you may not understand sort of how all-encompassing managing it can be. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your family's experience with diabetes and maybe what it was like as a dad to learn about your son's condition.
So yes, my experience with diabetes starts with type 1 diabetes. When my son was diagnosed in 2002, although I find myself in the medical device industry now, I'm not from medical device. I come from a point of wanting to solve a problem for a loved one. My son, I wanted to live easier and healthier with a disease that has a very big responsibility attached to it. With type 1 diabetes and with sufficiently advanced type 2 diabetes, a person becomes dependent upon this drug, insulin, to live on a daily basis. This is a very tricky drug to administer. There's no fixed dose. You can't just take it at the same time and the same dose every day to stay healthy. You actually have to do a lot of math. You have to do a lot of measurement. You have to be very disciplined and engaged, understand your own physiology, how this drug interacts with it, how food interacts with the drug. There's a lot of complexity, and 99.95% of the time, it's on the average person, because the clinician is not there to help them to titrate or dose this drug, which if given in an excessive amount can literally render a person unconscious, and unfortunately in some cases people die if they don't have assistance. Over time, if you take too little of it, you have all these nasty long-term complications of heart disease and kidney failure, amputation, blindness, et cetera. So I saw an opportunity just as a parent with a technology background, but not a healthcare or medical device background, to make it easier to dose this drug. It seemed that there was an opportunity to take the data that is collected by the patient by and large and to use some sort of algorithmic approach to enrich that data and perhaps give people advice as to how to take this drug over time. I became interested in the opportunities to automate the delivery of this drug, and as a donor supported work to take a continuous glucose monitor, an insulin pump, and an algorithm that sits in between the two to help dose this drug, helping to, at the end of the day, people sleep through the night, being confident that they're getting the right amount of insulin, not too much when they couldn't possibly do anything about it, getting the right amount of insulin during the day as they go about their daily activities to avoid the things that they fear in terms of the long-term consequences of the disease. The disease has a tremendous impact on quality of life because you're constantly having to think about it. There are very few diseases, even chronic diseases, where you have to be so vigilant and the disease is so omnipresent in terms of the responsibility of self-care. That really wears a person down. And people with chronic disease are just like us. If you don't have a chronic disease, your health is probably third, fourth, fifth on the list of things you care about. You know, you have your job and your spouse at the top, and depending which order is who you're talking to. You have your hobbies, your friends, and then you have your health. Well, people with chronic disease, it's the same thing. I saw a great opportunity to help people to live better by helping the technology to live more gracefully in their day-to-day existences, and that requires a different approach. So ours is very much patient-inspired. What makes it easier for the patient? What makes it easier to use, harder to make mistakes in using? All these kinds of things, which are really the essence of consumer-focused design or patient-led design. A very different frame I've been able to bring, and the people that work for Bigfoot have been able to bring. A number of us do have a personal connection to diabetes.
So, you know, you sort of touched upon this, but there's just an array of devices and technologies and drugs that go into managing diabetes. And I think it might be helpful for us to understand what that process looks like, maybe not thinking about Bigfoot's technology, but when your son was diagnosed, sort of the path that you guys had to navigate. Can you share with us a little bit about what sort of the standard, if there is a standard for managing diabetes, what that looks like right now?
Well, when my son was diagnosed in 2002, we were treated at the best care center in New York City, Columbia Presbyterian Nomi Berry Diabetes Center, world-class facility. We walked out of there with some prescriptions for vials of insulin and some needles, and literally a hand-drawn sliding scale of if this happens, do that, if that happens, do this. That was the standard of care then. And unfortunately today, for most people whose lives are dependent upon insulin, and this also includes type 2 diabetes, that is what people confront. Injections and sliding scales and stuff they have to memorize and equations they have to do in their own heads. That is the standard of care. Most people receive that approach. However, if they're lucky enough to have some of the gadgets, insulin pumps, continuous glucose monitors, this adds a tremendous amount of complexity to the patient experience. An insulin pump or the first semi-automated version of such, say the Medtronic 670G, is not just one prescription, it's literally 10 different prescriptions. The doctor writes a prescription for the pump, for the infusion set that has the cannula that infuses underneath the skin the insulin into the subcutaneous tissue, the reservoirs which hold the insulin that you have to load from the vial, the test strips and the blood glucometer that is used to calibrate the continuous glucose monitor, and so you have to have a prescription for the sensors and for the transmitter of that, all the way down to the actual lancet that pricks your finger to do the calibration, to calibrate the sensor so that it can feed into the closed loop system. That requires a separate prescription. So you literally, if you're a person using one of these systems, and it's not to pick on Medtronic, they're all the same today. The supply chain is very fragmented. It's all the complexity is foisted upon the patient. Literally, you have to do supply management in your kitchen cabinet at home. Every person with insulin-requiring diabetes that uses any of these gadgets has a cupboard in the kitchen where you do supply management for months of supplies, all these different prescriptions, co-pays, covered at different levels by different insurance. All of that is tremendously complicated, and that's before you get to using the devices, all of which have complicated manuals. They come from different companies, different software that interfaces with them if you're going to get the data into the cloud or to the doctor. You have to be your own IT department in order to use these devices. This is a paradigm that's applicable for clinicians, where you have trained, credentialed medical professionals that have continuing education, they have quality control. Real people, you can't count on that. People who are sloppy and have their health prioritized down the list of what they do on a day-to-day basis, it's got to be easy, simple. And so that's really the paradigm shift that we're trying to lead, is when you talk about patient-led or you talk about consumerized healthcare applications, it's got to be so simple. Fewer knobs, fewer switches, shorter manuals, quick start guides, not manuals, connected and digital, app-based, not paper. This is the rest of our lives today, how our lives work, but doing it in medical device, there are some challenges, but that's what we're trying to do.
So you've laid out a really good case as to show that this process is really complex for people today. Can you tell us a little bit about how Bigfoot is trying to change that?
Well, in order to change it, I think you have to start in your design effort. The device or the therapy, it needs to work for an average person of average skills with average healthcare support, with average insurance, average engagement in their own disease. This is a messy world we live in. Today, the very sophisticated patients that are well educated, have great insurance, and see the best doctors are the ones who get the devices. But you have to change the frame to people who are sloppy and less engaged, and whose doctors can't be counted upon to train them to use the devices successfully or to interpret the data that comes out of the devices. That's the biggest step, is you have to design for a different user, not the key opinion leader endocrinologist in our space, but actually a regular person. When you do that, you get a very different product, a much simplified product, one that really focuses on ease of use, that takes complexity out, and actually designing simple products is a very complex process. It takes a lot of the mess that usually is exposed to the patient, and it absorbs that on the company to fix in the background. But that's even before you get to the other customers in the ecosystem, because doing it for the patient in and of itself is a sufficient, I believe, goal or a necessary goal for successful business, but it's not a business in and of itself, because patients don't actually pay for these options, and they don't actually support them or prescribe them. You have to focus on the clinician as well. So the simplicity that we're bringing to the patient has to actually carry over in terms of solving real-world workflow problems for the clinicians. They must be able to prescribe and support these systems without any additional work. In fact, they need less work than they have today. The complexity for the patient is mirrored for the physician in all the data that needs to be interpreted, all the different configuration options on an insulin pump that need to be set, all the different and living titration parameters, even for somebody taking injections. That requires a lot of work on the part of the clinician. You have to take that out as well. But even solving the problem for the patient, solving the problem for the clinician, that isn't even sufficiently a business today. You have to solve the problem for the payer, which means that on a short term, meaning 2 years or less payback period, you have to be able to drive positive value in terms of healthcare economics. That's a pretty tight window and a pretty big lift. I wish, for the sake of my son, that the system cared about long-term complications, you know, the kidney failure and blindness and heart disease. But unfortunately, the way our healthcare system works, it can't afford to care about those long-term outcomes, because a payer, on average, your member switches to a new plan every 2 years. And so those long-term complications end up being somebody else's problem, the government's problem. We're, I don't want to say lucky, but we have an opportunity in diabetes, however, with insulin, to really focus on a short-term goal, which is keeping people out of the hospital for adverse insulin dosing events. My son's almost died a couple times. One time he was in the hospital in ICU for 3 days because he made a mistake with insulin. This is a very dangerous drug, and a lot of people spend time in the hospital because of it. If you can keep them out of the hospital, and also somewhat lower cost of the therapy itself, you can have a transformative impact on healthcare economics for payers. So you asked how we're trying to do this. We're trying to do it by starting with the patient, by making sure that we solve for clinicians what are the real-world issues in prescribing and supporting the therapy, and actually showing a healthcare economic benefit to payers.
So there are so many groups to consider in the development process, but as you just mentioned, sort of patients and users are top of mind. People's lives are extremely complex, and as you mentioned, you know, sometimes even patients that have chronic disease, their health is still number 3, number 4 on their priority list. How do you design a device with that in mind? Where in the development process and in the design process are you listening to users and taking into account their considerations? So
we have an advantage over a number of other companies in this respect. We are the people who use these devices. Bigfoot Biomedical was founded by 4 fathers of kids with type 1 diabetes. One of our founders actually had a wife has a wife with type 1 diabetes. He is the eponymous Bigfoot, who was the first person to hack into a medical device, an insulin pump, and a continuous glucose monitor, connect those to a smartphone, actually through an app, create an algorithmic approach to dosing insulin that his wife and son, both of whom have type 1 diabetes, have been using continuously for more than 5 years now. He's the smartest guy I ever met, but he's just a guy, and he did this himself. And what he did for himself and his family is more advanced, easier to use, safer than anything in any device company's pipeline, with the exception of Bigfoot. And one of the reasons we've been able to move so fast is we have some strong touch points with life with this disease. We have about 80 people at Bigfoot Biomedical today. 40% of them have a direct connection to the disease. About a dozen of us have it. A number of people have kids, spouses, parents. a lot of touch points with the disease to actually understand the footprint on daily life and the kinds of mistakes people make and the kinds of dangers they're exposed to. We didn't have to do focus groups to understand those, and it has allowed us to go very fast. We also have a bunch of clinicians on staff who have treated this disease in its complexity with little resources across heterogeneous populations. So we understand the challenges that the clinicians have in the real world messiness. We just went and hired people who understood the problem. That's one of the things that gives us an advantage.
I want to talk a little bit about this sort of DIY, do-it-yourself movement that you just mentioned, and Brian Maslish, your co-founder, AKA Bigfoot, hacking into a medical device to create this automated system. What do you think it says? So there are a number of people who have diabetes that are using these sort of DIY systems today, right now. What do you think it says about the industry and the pace of development that there are whole groups of patients that have sort of taken it upon themselves to create their own systems to manage their care?
Well, I think it says that it's not about the technology anymore. From what I can tell, and I've only been in a relatively short period of time, medical device used to be very focused on the technology, the engineering effort, what could I create, what machine to serve what purpose, and from there you found uses for these machines. Whereas today, all the key components of a diabetes treatment ecosystem have been invented. They've been created a while ago. Subcutaneously infused insulin from pumps, diagnostics, continuous glucose monitors, ones without calibration. All of this already exists. Cybersecurity, algorithms for doing predictive or prescriptive analytics, cloud systems for storing the data. All of this is here today, and so what my co-founder did was just integrate and assemble some existing technologies. That's, for me, an indication that the focus of a company should be more about integration and packaging and delivery and business model, and that's where most of the innovation is going to take place. I mean, if you look at an iPhone, Apple is an integrator. They don't own all the hardware that goes into the iPhone. They design the parts that don't exist to complement the parts that do exist, and then they package and distribute and create an ecosystem of software and connectivity that solves a problem. I think that's for at least chronic disease and these kinds of applications where you're focusing on real-world use. I think that's where it's going. It's less about the machines and it's more about the packaging of them.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that we spent a lot of yesterday discussing is interoperability, and that sort of being a key driver for folks in the medical device industry. I want to read something, just a little excerpt of something that you wrote that I think sort of highlights this. You wrote in an essay, quote, "Products are too often designed in a vacuum in the hopes they blend well with others in development or on the market, but the successful models that truly transform our user experience focus on ownership of the whole ecosystem." I think this is probably especially true in diabetes, where there's just an array of devices that patients need to work together, make work together on their own. But that's a big ask. How do you avoid designing in a vacuum?
Yeah, it's tough. Where do we stop and where does the rest of the world begin? We have made the decision that for this problem that we're solving, the delivery of insulin in a safe and efficacious way, that you need to have control of, from a design and packaging and delivery perspective, a sufficient number of these components. So you have to have the insulin delivery, whether it's shots and measuring how much people are injecting, telling them how much to inject, or whether it's an insulin pump and having direct control over that insulin delivery device. You also need to have a continuous glucose monitor that's tightly embedded. You have to package those together and connect them up to the smartphone that we carry around in our pockets, the supercomputer that is the access point for everything else in our lives. That you have to have the cloud systems that capture all the data and the customer systems that support all of those components. That is critical mass for solving this problem. That you can't just have a prescription for an insulin pump from one company and a prescription for a CGM from another company and then an app that talks to both of those. It literally can't work that way because it's too complicated. And from a regulatory perspective, the FDA wants to see things work all together. So that's what makes us a Class 3 medical device system that has to actually pick the components we're going to put together and then subject those to clinical trials. Our approach is more like Apple's than like the PCs was back. You're too young to remember, but early PCs, you could have an operating system from one company, Microsoft, and the motherboard from one company, and the keyboard and the monitor from another company, the sound card, the graphics card. People put together their systems. That's kind of like the tools for diabetes are today. You put it together yourself and make it work, and the interfaces between the tools, that's your problem to figure it out. Whereas Apple went a very different way and said, no, I'm going to have the operating system, I'm going to have the hardware, you can only use the components that I'm going to specify. And that may seem like you're narrowing down choice, but actually what you're doing is enabling access, because you're making it simple. My mother can use that. She can't use the PC. She can't use the Android phone. She uses the iPhone. So this control of the ecosystem and environment can create simplicity. The problem is that that's an expensive business to build. We were able to acquire some assets, an insulin pump company that had $150 million invested in it. We bought it for $5 million because it was just a component of a larger system. The value wasn't there. We licensed other components, did development work on algorithms, and we're $100 million into our journey. It'll take us another $100 million to launch our products. $200 million is a lot of money to raise in the medical device space.
Yeah, so while we're on the topic of fundraising, you guys recently closed, I think it was a $55 million Series B round with support from your partner Abbott, and then some other sort of non-traditional funders, I would say,
yes,
in the medical device space. Can you talk a little bit about your experience raising money, what it was like pitching your company and your idea, and how you sort of engaged these non-traditional players and why you engaged these non-traditional funders?
Well, I engaged non-traditional funders because, quite simply, we wouldn't exist if we didn't raise money from them. The traditional medical device investors, the venture investors, they're not interested in the space that we're in. It actually represents the things that they've walked away from. And when I say walked away from, traditional medical device investors today they're actually reversely not that interested in diabetes, because people have lost a lot of money in diabetes. Insulin pump companies, diagnostic companies, diabetes has not been good to medical device companies with the exception of a couple. Secondly, Class 3 medical device systems that require clinical trials, and therefore the FDA is seen to have a veto over the opportunity to have a business. There have been a lot of failed trials that have basically imploded device companies. They're very wary of Class 3 these days. And then third, large capital commitments. If you say you need $200 million to launch a product, the combination of those three is unfundable in traditional medical device. I think I proved it. But there are people who are interested in healthcare and devices and digital applications. It just needs to be someone who sees the opportunity through the lens of digital health, not through the lens of traditional medical device. We have found great opportunity in large family offices. We actually skipped the venture stage entirely. We don't have a single medical device venture investor. And it's a reflection of our particular developmental stage. We were able to go faster because of the assets we acquired, but we're already raising money from crossover investors that traditionally only invest in companies just before they go public. Some of those were reaching back earlier in the pipeline for us. So it was a necessity that we find other sources of money because traditional medical device investors weren't interested in what we're doing.
How did you go about finding, well, first of all, was it ever a little discouraging that these sort of traditional funders were not interested?
It was completely discouraging because they all think that this is a very toxic space. It kind of infects everybody else's thinking. If it's seen as a toxic space, it becomes a toxic space even more. We had to go somewhere where there wasn't the baggage, where people hadn't invested in things that were easy object lessons that could be superficially compared to what we're doing. we had to have a different lens. But to answer your question, yeah, it was very discouraging at first, but this company, apart from being a large value creation opportunity, is also a personal mission for those of us who founded it. This is our kids we're dealing with that are going to live better lives because of what we're doing. And I've also had the opportunity to meet a lot of people affected by this disease. I was involved for many years with the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, met thousands of families. A lot of people need the help. And so it was a bigger opportunity and responsibility than just the business. And so it gave us the motivation to carry through and to find those other sources.
Yeah, so how did you go about finding those other sources?
I talked to everybody I could. I presented at every forum where you would have a gathering of investors. I crashed every party. I networked with every possible opportunity to find a source of capital and somebody that was willing to take risks, that thought digital health was going to be a big thing, that thought there were opportunities to reinvent categories in healthcare. And we came across some investors who were willing to take a bet on us, and we were able to get that critical mass. Now we're at a point of, we have more proof points, and we have a sufficient scale of operations and have acquired access to all these technologies and been able to deploy them in a clinical trial and actually prove that they work. We're in a very different place now. But when it was all in the future, it took some vision, it took some risk, and I'm glad that we found the investors that would support that.
So, one of the things I think that imparts a large amount of risk, especially in the digital health space, is cybersecurity. And you mentioned that, your company began with somebody hacking into a medical device.
Yes.
So I think it really brings about the question, how are you guys tackling cybersecurity? It's a really sort of a big concern, especially when you're dealing with insulin, which is a drug that is so incredibly dangerous if dosed incorrectly.
Sure. Well, if you want to make a system secure, hire hackers to build it. That's part of the success. But the bigger challenge is that you really have to re-envision the technology system broadly. You can't just make a device by itself secure in talking to a phone. It involves more than just the device. It involves an entire architecture around the device. So let me give you a sense of what I'm talking about. In order to do what we're doing, which is to use an off-the-shelf smartphone, an app on an iPhone that you buy at the Apple Store that will be an interface to a chronic disease management system and allow you to dose insulin. In order to do that, it's not just about the insulin pump that this app talks to. It's about the manufacturing process. It's about how you record the components that go into a particular pump, who you send it to. It's about embedding a crypto key and having an ability to do cloud-based authentication for the one smartphone in the world that should be talking to this insulin pump. It's about the ability to do over-the-air firmware upgrades so that if anybody ever does hack into it, because security is not a static property, security is something that you need to constantly maintain. That's why we get upgrades dropped on us by iOS, because somebody hacked it and then they got to fix it. So we've actually created a medical device system that is living and upgradable so that when somebody does hack it, because I can't guarantee you they won't, if they spend enough time, they will be able to, we'll be able to shoot out an upgrade over the air without the user having to do anything, without them having to talk to us, and we'll be able to upgrade the medical device in the field and make it safe and ongoing secure. All that needed to be done as a system, so it changes the manufacturing, it changes the cloud systems, it certainly changes the essential design of the medical device. It incorporates the phone, which is in itself a dynamic and changing ecosystem. When iOS drops a new upgrade, we need to be able to validate our systems within 24 hours and turn around to the FDA and say with the new version of iOS that we're actually safe and able to operate. That has required us to build a set of technologies and an automated test suite that can test every aspect of system performance in an automated rapid-fire fashion within 24 hours. So when you talk about security, it's not just a clever design for the device itself. It's the entire ecosystem which is implemented or implicated, and the operating of the business must support that. So it requires a pretty dramatic rethink of your system architecture to do security.
That's quite a process. I want to turn now to some trends that we're seeing in the regulatory space and on Capitol Hill. I'm sure some device developers in here, but maybe more so our partners over in the pharmaceutical world, are thinking a lot about the right to try legislation that was recently passed and made into law. You and I were chatting about this earlier. It sort of strikes me as interesting because there's this, do-it-yourself, DIY diabetes community that's already said we're not waiting.
Yeah, we didn't ask.
Right. We didn't ask to try, we just did it. How do you guys at Bigfoot think about or balance the sort of healthy tension that exists between that attitude of we're not waiting and we desperately need these devices to work all together and we want the system on the market now with the demands of patient safety?
Yeah. Well, so my co-founder, Brian Maslish, who was the first person to create a real-world ambulatory automated insulin delivery system, he did it. He actually went to the FDA and asked them, can I share this? Can I actually, upload the recipe to the internet and share some of what I've developed, because I know a lot of other people could benefit from it as well. And they said, yes, if you want to be a class 3 medical device company and go through clinical trials. And then he said, okay, I get it. I can't. He didn't. He went another path. He and I joined up, and we decided to go and create a hardened version of this that would be tested the right way and developed. And the FDA serves a great purpose, and there is a reason for having quality systems and a regulatory process and clinical trials. They will make it safe for the broader world. Unfortunately, it does take a long time to do that. And in the meantime, 1,000 other people have done this, copied what he did to begin with. The DIY community is pretty prolific. At some point, that's going to end badly, unfortunately. You'll get the technology in the hands of a person who just isn't sophisticated enough to understand how these pieces are working together, and then something bad will happen. We're racing to try and head that off, and the FDA is helping us because the FDA sees that as a risk too. It has perversely, because of this horse getting out of the barn, so to speak, of DIY, it has made the FDA more committed to enabling innovation in these companies because they see it as a risk too. Users don't want to hack their own medical devices. They've got other things to do. They're doing it because they have to, because the solutions they can buy or have access to are not as good as the ones that they can create themselves. And when you can actually deliver ones that are more reliable and robust and give the same features that they're looking for, then they'll stop. And so the FDA has moved faster, been more collaborative, and supported more innovation, specifically because of the DIY community.
How often do you guys at Bigfoot hear from people in the community saying, where's the system?
How long has it been? Literally, I will get Facebook messages today. When's the clinical trial? When can I be in it? This is a different space. Usually everybody has a challenge with clinical trials. Recruiting for clinical trials always goes slowly. It's expensive. It's just the opposite for these. Literally, there are groupies that are sitting on clinicaltrials.gov, and they're looking for these trials to open up. The first person that ever wore a Bigfoot system in Santa Barbara at the Sansom Diabetes Institute came from Arizona. She saw the opportunity and was willing to fly out there and stay there as long as it took to do the trial. People are desperate for this stuff, and they tell us. We're a little different in that we have a notable presence in social media and almost, one would say, a brand. We've got about 1/3 of the social media footprint of Medtronic Diabetes, more presence and awareness in the marketplace than companies that have been in business for a decade. And that's because of our history as patients who have taken the reins to try and make a difference in this disease space. And people have a lot of hope in us, and they certainly have need.
Yeah. So you mentioned a clinical trial. You guys are gearing up for a clinical trial. Can you share any details about that?
Yes, well, we will be doing a number of clinical trials because we're developing at least 2 Class 3 medical device systems. One that is for people taking shots, people taking shots and using the data in order to help them to get on the right dose of a long-acting insulin like Elantis or a mealtime insulin. The people think about what we're doing as artificial pancreas or pumps and CGM, and it is. That is one of our products, but that'll be the most expensive one. Most people are going to be on shots for the foreseeable future in terms of dosing insulin, and all of the ability to gracefully design devices that are simple, to knit them together in a secure communications framework, to make them smart by embedding algorithms and using data science in order to basically tell them how much of a drug to take or to actually dose it through the pump. It's all the same thing. We'll have 2 Class 3 trials going in 2019, one for injection and one for the pump-based therapy, and we anticipate launching products in 2020.
And when did you start this entire journey, just so we get a sense of how long this process has taken you?
Well, it depends whether you count my time before, because I literally in 2002, after my son was diagnosed, I was at a medical device conference 2 weeks later that I found on the internet, just poking around, asking questions, and that's where I learned about an artificial pancreas, which was then being tested on dogs. I had a long journey working with the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation as a donor, helping them raise a lot of money to do proof of concept trials through a network of sites around the globe, to tackle some regulatory issues, to help do healthcare, or rather regulatory advocacy and education with the FDA, which has resulted in some very clear, a very clear pathway through to the marketplace. Healthcare economic studies. I ended up being the CEO of JDRF for 4 years. And then I founded Bigfoot with Brian Maslish in 2014 after I left JDRF, and after he had demonstrated successfully that you could take these technologies and put them to real world use, and that the world was ready, and it just needed companies that were committed to the right commercial vision.
So to sort of encapsulate that, your son was diagnosed, you became involved with JDRF, you became the CEO of JDRF, and then you launched a medical device company to create a solution for people like your son.
Yes. Yes. So 16 years since my son was diagnosed, I've been working on this, and then for the last 4 as officially a medical device CEO.
So, a lot of people in the world are diagnosed with conditions like diabetes. Not everyone goes on to become the CEO of a foundation that helps fund research, and not everyone goes on to start medical device companies. Can you share an experience or something that made you say, I have to get involved here?
I just thought there could be better and needed to be better, and my son needs it to live a safe and healthy and long life. And I got inspired along the way by meeting a lot of other people who need the same thing. And it just seemed like that needed to happen. And I will admit I had no idea how I was going to do it in 2002. I probably had only a hazy idea in 2014 when we started this company. And we're still working out some of the fundamental pieces. But this is something that needs to happen. And we have the critical mass of people who understand all the different technologies and competencies together. So I'm sort of the cheerleader for that whole outfit, and a very stubborn person, but other people are making it happen on the ground. This is not just about Bigfoot. This is a change that's coming in healthcare. The shift to the consumer of these systems or therapies that support life with chronic disease, the whole focus on the payer in terms of healthcare economics, enabling a clinical care delivery environment to be successful, even if you don't have well-trained clinicians, even if you have scarce resources. All of these are themes in the broader healthcare ecosystem, and we're just tapping into them and riding the wave, so to speak.
I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. Are there any in the audience?
So we did have a question out here. Okay.
Hello, thank you for coming. We're actually a neighbor of yours, and I walk past your building once a week when I ride the light rail to work.
Oh, wow.
So nice to meet you at last. I've always been curious. For your sloppy users, when they accidentally drop their phone in the toilet or leave it in the ball game or whatever they do, what is the implication to their care?
Well, it has to be something that works, even if the components are not there or not working. Like you said, people drop their phones. Literally, my daughter has dropped her phone in the toilet 3 times, which is inconceivable to me, but has happened. It is the case that you need to have systems that are going to fail gracefully if any of the components are broken or not present. Our system's designed to operate in the absence of the phone for a significant period of time. That's because all the smarts for how, for instance, the insulin pump doses are embedded in the pump itself. The phone is just an interface and connectivity to the cloud. Think a keyboard and a monitor is to a CPU. The CPU is actually the medical device. That's where you have control and can validate. That is what keeps it safe. So the answer is the design accommodates all the different use cases where you will have failures or unavailability of the components.
Great. A question from me. I've dropped my phone in the toilet. You've had an extraordinary run since 2014, I would say, in terms of just achieving milestone success, fundraising. What do you think was the lowest moment of your tenure at Bigfoot Biomedical, and what was your best moment?
Well, the lowest moment would definitely be related to the fundraising. I really thought that it would be easier to raise money for this concept than it turned out being. And I've had a successful career in raising money from the usual suspects, the venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road who, all the different venture firms that have their specialties. I mean, I thought I would go and, take orders there like I had for some other companies that were in more frothy spaces. And the shock of the people who would tell me, yes, you're doing it the right way. That's obviously the answer. And I love your team, and I'm not going to go with it near it with a 10-foot pole because it's a toxic space. And how reputation of people having lost money on ventures that seem only superficially similar to what we were doing could really dry up capital for large opportunities, especially ones that were so needed and so such a desperate patient population with a lack of options to live well today. That was very shocking and very humbling. So I had to learn to raise money in medical device for a hard business, and it required us to be very creative. But the things that don't kill you make you stronger. In terms of best day, well, the best day so far has been when the first person wore a Bigfoot system in a clinical trial and basically declared that this is what she'd been waiting for her whole life. And the best day will be in the future when my son wears the system. He will be the first customer for the Bigfoot system.
Very cool, thank you. Other questions? We got a couple over here. So I'll go here and then there.
Good morning, Jeffrey. First of all, thank you for what you're doing. As a father who's walked in similar shoes with a type 1 daughter, thank you. Secondly, obviously, you have perspective from the JDRF side and now on more the commercial side. Where do you see the future going? Obviously, JDRF tries to raise a lot of money. Sanford Health in Sioux Falls is committed to one of their top 4 initiatives to find a cure for this. Where do you see those 2 roads converging from a technology and management of the disease to potentially finding a cure?
I think, unfortunately, we're going to be managing the disease for a long time. Curing type 1 diabetes will require reprogramming the autoimmune system, which we still hazily understand, or the immune system rather, to replenish cells that were destroyed. This is stuff people will win Nobel Prizes for in the future yet before we are sufficiently understanding of all the different mechanisms. Unfortunately, I think there's going to be a lot of runway for what Bigfoot's doing. I wish there weren't. I could do something else. But I think there is going to be a lot of work yet to do before this disease is cured. But I think it can be, with technology, rendered an inconvenience rather than a really debilitating chronic disease. And that's my goal.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks again for your presentation today and the passion that you bring to this project you've been running with. Wondering out loud a little bit about if you had to do it all over again, and you started again knowing with the knowledge you have now, do you think you'd be able to shorten the path that you've been on? And I know these paths are not necessarily straight and narrow. Were there things that discouraged you along the way that said, I may not be able to complete this project?
I've often thought about that, and not just for the 4 years of Bigfoot, but for the 16 years I've been, working on this problem. I think that there is just a time for some things to happen, and Bigfoot is here today because of a confluence of a bunch of different things that came together in time. One, the technologies became mature. These smartphones and the security with which we can communicate, the cloud storage and ability to do massive simulations for pennies in the cloud that used to require a supercomputer, the cost of computation and storage, the ability to outsource to a large degree engineering efforts, to bring pieces together and be an integrator as a small company, not having to create every device, not having to create every function to oversee every aspect of every device. Healthcare basically breaking under the cost and payers looking for new models of value-based pricing, the lack of endocrinologists, the spiraling population of people who need those endocrinologists in order to manage insulin being distributed. All of that came together at the right time. I think there was a maturity and awareness in the healthcare system of the need for some change, and then a possibility of change based on the technologies. The FDA came on board at a certain point. In 2010, what we're doing wouldn't have been possible. In 2013, it became possible based on work that the JDRF, frankly, did in order to help get them to focus on the area and define a regulatory pathway. I think things happen when they happen for a reason, and Bigfoot became possible in 2014. Had I tried to start a company and do this in 2002 or 2006, I would have failed. Across the board. There would have been certain things that just weren't ready in the ecosystem. And so I think we're moving about as fast as we can or could have. In retrospect, there's opportunities to optimize, but I think we exist because of fundamental trends that are much bigger than us.
Great. And one more question over here.
Jeff, Ken Michike. I'm with a company QT. We're a software company, but I'm located in Boston, and I appreciate your effort. Necessity drives the innovation. I was at a conference recently in Boston. Ed Damiano, who's a biomedical engineer, is in the same space. He's trying to develop a device because he's got a son with diabetes. And what was interesting is I chatted with him one day and I said, what's your greatest fear? And as you said, he said, beside my son becoming ill at night in his sleep, or this trial failing and not having a better monitoring device, he said, my greatest fear is when the trials are over, what do these patients go back to? So when you look at your clinical trials for people that are trying the device and the trial's going to end and they're going to come off the device, what's Bigfoot Medical's go forward thinking when that happens? Because as you said, you go back to this broken process versus a better versus a better system that you put in their hands.
Well, we exist to deliver solutions, and a variety of them, to the most people. So as soon as the FDA will let us, we're going to put systems in the hands of those people at Bigfoot Biomedical. I think one of the important things to recognize, though, is that one solution won't fit everybody. There's been a lot of focus on the pump users and the very sophisticated patients that are using CGM, continuous glucose monitoring today. But in this country, about 65% of type 1 diabetics are using injections to deliver insulin. If you look at insulin requiring type 2, it's about 99%. In Europe, type 1 has about 10% pump penetration. Most people are not using pumps in the sexiest version of the technologies. We're just as interested in taking all that goodness from data science and helping people take shots of the right doses. So we want to help all those people as soon as we can in the greatest scale, and that requires having a business that can do that.
Jeffrey, I want to thank you for your work and also for your time here today. Let's hear it for Jeffrey.